Alright, welcome back to a brand new video. In this one, I'm going to go over how to actually use tools within your Livekit cloud agent. Now, if you don't know what Livekit is, it is essentially just an infrastructure to build AI voice assistants or voice receptionists. And if you're unfamiliar with them, you can think of them like using ChatGPT for a specific business that you can talk to on the phone. And businesses usually create these to either reduce the amount of time that they spend on the phone for calls that they don't really need to be taking, or a lot of them actually use it for marketing purposes where, I could create a voice agent that's going to call all of my old customers to tell them about a brand new offer that we have. Now, this video is going to center around how do you use tools within Livekit. Now, a tool is essentially a word or an umbrella term for giving your agent the ability to do things. In this specific instance, I'm actually going to show you how to create a tool that will check your calendar to see whether or not your office is closed. I'll give you an example. So I've got my calendar here, and there's only a singular event. You can see that on the 23rd, it says closed. So if I were to go ahead and call my voice agent and ask it.
Hi there, I'm here to help you check if the business is open or closed on specific dates.
Amazing. So are you guys open on the 23rd?
The business is closed on the 23rd.
Ah, that's unfortunate. What about the 24th?
The business is open on the 24th.
Amazing, thank you very much. So obviously this agent is purely to do this one specific activity, but this is what takes an AI voice agent from just a simple sort of nice to have that has generic information to something that businesses are actually implementing to help reduce a lot of the workload that their staff has to take on for calls that they really shouldn't be on. Let's dive into how to actually build it. So I've shown you what it can do, and there's gonna be a couple different softwares that we use to make all of this magic happen. The two main ones are gonna be Livekit and N8N, which I'm gonna show you both. Livekit, like I said, is simply the infrastructure where we're building all of our voice agents. I've got an entire video talking about how to use it, how to set it up, but in case you're new, it's essentially, if you use Vappy or Retail, it's very similar to those platforms. It's a bit more developer friendly. It's also a lot more scalable if you start to self-host. And I've got an entire video coming out about how to self-host Livekit. But for the purposes of this specific video, we don't need to get into all that. The thing that's important within Livekit is you're gonna have your overview, which is essentially how all of your agents are doing, the different sessions. Think of these like the different calls that your agent has been on. So the call, for example, that I just did, if I were to refresh my screen, and this is one of our demo accounts, but you can see actually it's still considering it as active. So there's probably still some stuff going on in the back end. And let's see here what was being spoken of. So it's not going to give me any information because it's considering the call is still active. It should stop here in a bit. And then if we come back to it and it's not active anymore, I'll show you what that actually looks like. Then if you scroll down even more, you have your actual agents themselves. Think of these like specific deployments of different agents. So I could have an agent for one business, I could have a different agent for a different business, or sometimes people will actually separate agents based on a use case. So in this case, I could have an agent whose sole job is just to answer the generic questions. But let's say somebody were to call in and I were to recognize their phone number using a different tool. Well, I could actually maybe transfer them over to a different agent, especially if I had a business where new customers and old customers call me all the time but have vastly different use cases. It could be really helpful to ensure quality that I have two different agents based on whether or not they're an existing or new customer. But for the purposes of this video, all you're really gonna need to do is either go to create a new agent, or in my case, I'm just gonna go and edit my existing one. Now, once you get here, you can go into edit in Builder, and then you're gonna have a couple different options. Obviously, a lot of the standard stuff that you're used to seeing if you've used any other voice AI system. But if this is your first, you can consider this prompt as the main instruction. So whenever your agent joins the call, this is essentially what you're telling it to do. Couple different things that you want to take into consideration. And the framework that we use is actually called CARES, and that stands for Context, Action, Rules, Execution, and Security. And these five, although pretty self-explanatory, are a really easy way to frame all of our agents. And I've got an entire video dedicated to how to prompt these voice agents. So if you want the link to that, it'll be one of the links in the description below. Now, getting back to our voice agent, we have super simple instructions right here. Your friendly voice assistant, and because the main thing I want to show is its ability to call a tool that can check my calendar for whether or not we are closed or not, that's really all it's doing here. And if I sort of dive deeper into it, it says your friendly voice assistant that helps users check whether the business is open or closed on specific dates. Here's what you can do. Important behavior, always prefer calling the date normalizer tool instead of guessing dates. This is super important. And the way to visualize this, if you are new to creating these agents, is you have your main prompt. And then think of the tools like a tool belt. You know, like Batman has his tool belt? Well, that's what these tools are. They are options that your voice agent can invoke when in need. I'll give you an example. I could have a tool that's called a customer search tool, and I could invoke this tool whenever the customer says that they're an existing customer. But now I need to figure out, okay, well, if they say they're an existing customer, then we probably already have them in our database. The question becomes, well, how will I find this individual in my database? I could either use a phone number, I could use an email address, I could use an order ID, I could use there are plenty of different options that I could use to actually identify who this customer is. Now the simple ones, obviously phone number, which are pretty self-explanatory, but let's use order ID as an example. What I would do within the tool, and I'll show you here in a second, I would put the parameter as order ID, and I would tell it, if you want to call this tool, it's going to search my database. The one thing you need to send though is the order ID. And for security purposes, you also need to send the associated phone number or the associated email address with it, so that I can't just call in and say a random order ID and get a bunch of information back. You would probably at least want two completely separate pieces of information to make sure that you're giving the right info to the right person. Now, if you want an entire video breaking down how to do this process, let me know. But at a 30,000 foot view, you send these two parameters to your database. Your database then searches to see whether or not we have any information that matches what the tool sent over. And if it does return anything, it'll send it back to the voice agent, who can now communicate about that specific order. So I could have shipment date, I could have order update statuses, I could have whether or not a refund was given, etc., etc. That's why tools are so important, because they are what take your agent from well, this is kind of a cool gimmick, to, oh, I can actually save a lot of my staff's time, because these questions are so generic, they're so monotone. It doesn't really require any degree of human intelligence. The customer simply has a problem that our voice agent can now solve for them. So getting back to our example of checking whether or not the office is actually open, here's where things get interesting. So I've got my instructions, pretty straightforward. And then at the top, you're gonna see instructions, models, and voice. This is essentially where you get to dictate what LLM you're using. An LLM could be ChatGPT or GPT-4, GPT-5. You might have heard the words Gemini, maybe Claude or Anthropic. These are all different brains of how to interact. Now, for the purposes of this video, we don't have to get into all that. The important toggle that you want to look at to create a brand new tool is where it says action. Now, an action is simply what your voice agent can do. And you're going to notice that it says HTTP tools right at the top. This is where you want to go to. Where it says HTTP tools, I'm going to create a new one to show you how to do it. Go to add new one, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to recreate the old one. So in this case, I'm going to say, is office closed? Or I could even put, is office open? And then right below that, this is a really important portion. Remember how I told you that these tools are like the tools in a sort of tool belt? You want to give a really good description of what your tool does. And this is how you think about it. Whenever somebody says something to your voice agent is aware of all the different tools that it has under its belt. So it'll see its main prompt, which is how it answers, and then it'll see that I have 3 different tools I can use. And at every point in the conversation, it's essentially deciding, do I use this tool or not? And it's deciding on what tool to use based on the description. So if you give a vague description, it might fire the tool when it shouldn't have, or even worse, it might not fire the tool when it needs to fire it. So it's really important you get crystal clear on what this tool does and when it should use it. In this case, it's pretty simple. So I'm just going to say, use this tool whenever the agent or whenever the user asks whether we are open on a specific day. You must only call this tool, and here's the important part, when they've given you, and then I can put example, and then I could even put the sentences like, are you open tomorrow? Or are you, let's see here, are you open on next Saturday? And the reason why I say that is we want to only check specific days of the week. We don't want to have a time range. Now, while you could, for this purpose, I'm going to stick it to a singular day. And I want to make sure that somebody says, when are you guys open? That it doesn't actually call this tool, because when are you guys open isn't a sentence or isn't a question that would have a singular day associated with it. Now, the other piece of this is whether or not this is going to be the type of tool that this is. If you're familiar with APIs, this will be pretty simple, but if not, the get, post, etc. that you see here essentially just refers to, are you sending information somewhere or are you receiving information from somewhere? So in this case, we actually want to make a request that then returns some type of information. So it'll be a GET request. If I was sending information, for example, if I was creating an event in a calendar, then I would actually use a POST request because I am sending information to this calendar. I'm gonna make a GET request, and then I'm gonna say URL. Now this is where you're going to need to bring in some third-party tool. In this case, I'm gonna use something called N8N, which is simply a really visual way of connecting different softwares together. The two softwares you have to connect is gonna be my Livekit agent, which is what we've been looking at, and I need to have a calendar somewhere. Now, this calendar is gonna be Google Calendar for the time being, but you could replace it with Outlook calendar, it could be a Zoho calendar, it could be any sorts of calendar that has an API or an application programming interface, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying it can communicate without having to use a bunch of screens. Now, if your software doesn't have an API, this is gonna get a lot more difficult because there's no way for this agent to be able to interact with your calendar. And if you do wanna know whether or not your calendar has an API, just Google the software's name and API, and you will quickly see they have documentation about it. So getting back, now that we have our GET request, let's actually jump into N8N to get our URL. Now, I've already got an automation set up here, but if you've never used N8N, all you're gonna have to do is gonna be a link in the description to actually download this sort of file. And then once you do download it, you can just import from file and download it here. A couple different things I should probably mention at this point. We have one more software called OpenAI or ChatGPT that we're using, and we're using it for a very specific reason. When you download the file, you'll see these 4 nodes. The first node is essentially the address. So whenever we make this GET request, we have this URL. You can think of the URL as the address for this specific automation. And this automation does 2 things. Firstly, it actually formats whatever the user said in a way that our Google Calendar can understand. Because remember how I put in Livekit, here it says, are you open tomorrow? Well, programmatically speaking, I can't really put the word tomorrow into my calendar because it won't understand it. Now, as a person, obviously I can go in my calendar and I can see, okay, well, tomorrow we're closed, but I can't search up programmatically or through API the word tomorrow. It just won't work. We need to format it in a way that Google Calendar will understand. And the way Google Calendar understands it is actually using their own sort of, not specific, but they have a programmatic way of accepting different variables. I'll show you. So let's go into the ChatGPT node. When you're using this for the first time, it's going to require you to have an OpenAI API key. Now, if you don't have an OpenAI API key, you can just go to platform.openai.com and go to settings, go to API keys, and you're going to see a bunch of different API keys in here. Just create a brand new one, and you're going to go back into N8N. You're going to plus on this connect to credential with, create a new credential, and you're going to paste your API key right there. Simple as that. Now that we have our API key connected, we can now connect to essentially ChatGPT, but in the background. So I go to, now I have to sort of select what model do I want to use. For this specific case, once again, I'm taking this from the perspective if you're not really a developer. So feel free to sort of watch the video quicker if you're familiar with a lot of this, but I want to make sure that this is accessible to as many people as possible. So whenever you go into N8N and you select your different OpenAI models, the way to think about it is there's a spectrum, or there's sort of give and take. There's pros and cons to different models. Some models are smarter. The downside though is they're slower, and more importantly, they're more expensive. The other side is some models are lighter, meaning they're cheaper, they're faster. However, they're not as intelligent. For a lot of use cases, you would typically want to go for really the smartest model possible because usually quality is the most important thing. However, and it also depends on your use case. For a voice agent, for example, I would try to use smarter models, even if I have to sacrifice speed of the agent. The reason for that is people will forgive latency, which is how long does it take for an agent to respond. What they will not forgive is uselessness, meaning if the robot says something that is obviously nonsensical, I will hang up much more often than if the robot is just a little bit slower. And that's not just me, that is customer behavior in general. They will forgive latency. They will not forgive uselessness. So based on that knowledge, what model do we pick? This is a super simple use case, which is just take a word and transform it into something that Google Calendar can understand. So I could use it, I just put a super cheap model, which is 4.1 mini, but you probably could have gotten away with any of these models. It doesn't really matter. So just pick the cheapest one you got. And then I've got the prompt, which is essentially just the instructions for the specific use case. In this case, I told it, you are a date/time range parser for Google Calendar queries. The input is going to be today's time and day, and as well as the text. And we got this text from Livekit that was sent over through the tool. That was one of the parameters. If you'll recall, I've got a parameter here, which I haven't even added. Let me show you how to do that. So in my parameter, if I were to go on edit on this one, you can see that I've got a name here called a date search, and its type is string. Now, the parameter is essentially what are you sending with the tool. You've called a tool, which essentially just means that you have triggered an automation, but there's usually going to be some associated data points with it. In this case, the main data point that we're trying to transfer over is the date that the person said. So if they said tomorrow, well, I want to send over the word tomorrow. If it was the 16th, I want to send over the 16th. That's exactly what this parameter is. It says the date the user would like to know for open has to be in the format that the user said. This is important because we do not want Livekit or our voice agent to try to predict what day it is. The reason for that is this agent isn't connected to the internet. It doesn't know what day it is. It's only as accurate as when its training was done. So what I mean by that, if this agent was trained back in 2024, it'll still think that's 2024. So it'll throw off what day it is. And we don't want to deal with that right now. There are ways around it, but for the time being, we can make things way simpler by just saying, whatever the user said, just send it over to me. Perfect. And obviously you want to make that a required field, because there is no situation in which this tool should be called and this parameter shouldn't be included. Every time this tool is called, I want this thing to be included. So now, if I go back to N8N, that's what this is. It essentially just means, here's what the user said. And then just convert it to the time range that is appropriate for Google Calendar's API, which looks like this. And by this -4 is the Eastern time zone. Now, what I would suggest to do is if you want to do this for yourself, just take this prompt, put it into ChatGPT, say, make this work for X time zone, and it'll work. And you can even improve upon it. Let's say you were working in different time zones, or you had people call in from all over the world. Part of the parameter that you would set in here is you would put time zone. And then I would add a description, which is the user's time zone. And I would also add in here, you cannot call this tool until you know the user's time zone. Obviously, I'm not going to press save. One more thing I would do though is I would go into the instructions of the model itself, because remember, the model is using the description of the tool. It's not using the parameters, only the description, at least not in any way that's meaningful for our conversation. And I would put in here in the tool usage thing, the text says, okay, reason, interpretation, etc. User text, the user's original, correct. And then I would add another one, which is if the user hasn't mentioned it, you must get the user's time zone before calling tool. Press save, and that'll make sure, I'm sure you have to tweak a little bit, but that will ensure that the robot gets both the time they want to come in or the time that you want to book this appointment and what time zone they're in. Now, once you've done that, essentially all that's left is to take the output of this ChatGPT node or OpenAI node. And also, by the way, you want to click on output content as JSON. This is where we get into the Google Calendar node. Is Google Calendar essentially accepts two parameters. You have a start date and an end date. So if I were to run the previous node here, or let me just go to an old execution. And if I were to run this one, I can see that it output both the start date and the end date. I need both for Google Calendar because I'm essentially telling Google Calendar, look between these dates and see if there's any event in here. And if there are, then consider my thing closed or my office closed. So then within Google Calendar, this is what showed up. So it said start time 24th, end time 25th. And it said, am I available? Yes, I am. But if we look at the previous execution though, the one where it said the 23rd, which was right before, you'll notice that the time here was 23rd to the 24th, and available was false. It was false because I looked at my calendar, I have an event going on all day, which just says closed. And then the last node that you have in here is a response to webhook node. This is pretty straightforward. We're just saying that whatever comes out of this Google Calendar node, just send it back to the webhook that originally sent it as the return. And all I said was response body, office open, then true or false. And that's pretty much it. The agent will then take that response and will continue the conversation based on what it got. These types of tools are what allow you to do this.
Hi there.
Hi there. Are you guys open on January 2nd?
Yes, we are open on January 2nd.
Amazing. Now, what about January 14th?
Yes, we are open on January 14th as well.
Phenomenal. Now, last question. What about December 23rd?
We are closed on December 23rd.
Thank you so much. And as you saw, I can keep asking the same question again and again and again, and I was going to keep creating these tool calls to my calendar. Now, this is probably the most simple use case of this, but in production, whenever you're actually deploying these agents for real with a bunch of different use cases, you might have 10 different tools that you call, and you can have sub-tools. For example, let's say you had a tool to find a specific customer. And then there's a true or false statement, which is if you didn't find a customer, no problem at all, return, I haven't been able to find you. However, if I did find a customer, then you can have a secondary tool, which essentially returns any order data associated with the customer that you just found. So this stuff can get pretty in-depth. The point of this video is to at least give you a general understanding of what a tool is, how it works, because regardless of how complicated it is, this is the major foundation. You have an agent with a specific set of instructions. That set of instructions has a tool belt under it that you have to clearly define what every tool does. And then as the conversation is happening, the agent is determining, do I need to use said tool? And importantly, it is also assessing whether or not the parameters are satisfied for the tool to be able to be called. Because I can say, are you guys open? But if there's no date, then it can't call a tool. Without further ado, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about tools, if you want specific videos on a specific tool sort of use cases, let me know. I'd love to make them. The next one I've got coming in is going to be how to create a gigantic knowledge base so that you don't have to stuff all of your business's info into the prompt. You can just connect it to a sort of Google Doc or Google Drive, and it will take that information for you as time or as the conversation is going. Thanks for watching.